The city lay where concrete surrendered to trees, where the last neat block of suburban houses gave way to a stretch of green that refused to be fully mapped. On one side were sidewalks, streetlights, mailboxes aligned with quiet precision. On the other, forest paths twisted into shadow, old and unpaved, marked not by signs but by memory. The outskirts of Portland had learned to coexist with both, and so had the people who lived there. They knew when to stop mowing lawns, when to let fences rot, when not to ask questions about why some neighbors only appeared at night, or why certain buildings never changed owners. The pack had embedded itself into the area decades ago, carefully, patiently. It presented itself as a cluster of ordinary enterprises, a modern gym with dark glass windows and extended hours, an auto repair shop that never advertised yet always had work, 2 coffee places that opened early and closed late, and a charitable foundation that organized food drives and youth programs. Everything looked legitimate, even admirable. Beneath that surface ran a rigid hierarchy older than the city itself, enforced not by laws but by instinct, scent, and quiet displays of dominance. Order was not debated, it was assumed. Myra Langford moved through this world without ever fully belonging to it. She lived in a small studio apartment near the river, in a building that smelled of damp concrete and old paint. From her window she could see water sliding past rocks and debris, reflecting the glow of distant streetlights in broken lines. At night, when the city quieted down, the river carried sounds from far away. Traffic hum, wind in trees, the occasional echo of something animal that never quite revealed itself. Myra had grown, used to listening without reacting. She worked nights as a dispatcher for a private security firm contracted by several businesses in the area, including those quietly owned by the pack. Her job was to watch screens, track alerts, coordinate responses. It required patience, focus, and the ability to notice patterns others dismissed as noise. Myra was good at it. She saw connections where others saw coincidence, recognized when a glitch was not a glitch, when movement on a camera followed intention rather than chance. The pack valued her for this. She was useful. She had grown up among them after her parents died, taken in not out of kindness but obligation. Her presence had always been provisional. Her wolf never came. While other children shifted during adolescence, stumbling through their first transformations with bruises and pride, Myra remained unchanged. No heightened senses, no second heartbeat under her skin. To the pack, that absence defined her more than any skill or loyalty ever could. She was empty where it mattered, human by default, tolerated but never embraced. She learned early not to resent it. Resentment required hope, and hope was a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she cultivated neutrality. She listened more than she spoke. She moved aside when stronger bodies entered a room. She memorized rules no one bothered to explain to her, reading them in posture and tone. Survival became a quiet discipline. The only exception had been Cale Voss. Years ago, when she had crossed into the wrong territory by accident, chased by a group of unaffiliated wolves who saw opportunity in her isolation, it had been Cale who found her. He had tracked her for miles, intervened without hesitation, and carried her back across invisible borders she had never known existed. He paid for her medical care, silenced questions, and declared her under his protection with a finality that discouraged argument. From that moment on, her status was fixed. She was marked as his responsibility, though not his equal. Cale was the alpha of the pack, and everything about him reflected that role. He moved with controlled precision, never wasted energy, never raised his voice. His presence settled rooms rather than dominating them outright. He understood power as something maintained through consistency, not spectacle. After that night, he kept his distance from Myra. He made sure she was safe, employed, accounted for, but he did not offer closeness. He became a constant outline at the edge of her life, like a building she passed every day without entering. Myra adjusted. She did not romanticize him or their connection. She understood that whatever he had done for her came from duty, perhaps guilt, perhaps an old code he refused to break. She learned to live alongside his shadow, benefiting from its shelter without mistaking it for warmth. The annual gathering of the pack took place in early autumn, when the air sharpened and leaves began to fall without yet decaying. It was held in the gym after hours, the space transformed by lowered lights and rearranged equipment. This was where roles were reaffirmed, disputes quietly settled, and the coming year outlined without ceremony. Attendance was expected. Absence was noted. Myra attended as she always did, standing at the periphery, observing. She wore nothing remarkable, blending into the background as she had trained herself to do. The room hummed with restrained energy, bodies tuned to one another, instincts brushing against the surface. She felt none of it directly, only the tension it created in the air. It happened without warning. A shift inside her, subtle but undeniable. The world seemed to tilt as if its center had moved. Her awareness narrowed, drawn toward a single point. Cale stood across the room, speaking to one of the elders, his posture composed. The pull was not emotional at first. It was physical, almost structural, like gravity recalibrating itself. Myra's breath caught. Her skin prickled. Something inside her aligned with him in a way that felt irreversible. She had heard the stories. She knew the theory of fate bonds, of rare connections that overrode logic and rank. She had never believed one could involve her, and yet her body responded before her mind could argue. The sensation was not comforting. It was invasive, precise, exposing. It made her feel suddenly visible in a room where invisibility had been her shield. The pack noticed immediately. Heads turned, movements stilled. Those sensitive to such things caught the change in her scent, the tension in her stance, the way her focus locked. The elders exchanged looks. Whispers did not rise, they were unnecessary. Recognition spread through the room like a quiet alarm. Myra understood then that she had become a problem. Cale felt it too. His attention shifted to her, sharp and assessing. For a brief moment, something crossed his expression that Myra could not name. Then it was gone, replaced by control. He did not approach her. He did not acknowledge the connection. Instead, he adjusted his position in the room, creating distance, redirecting attention with deliberate efficiency. He spoke, moved, concluded matters as if nothing had changed. But everything had. By not claiming her, he sent a clear message. By not defending her, he allowed interpretation to take root. He framed the connection as a flaw rather than a bond, an error rather than fate. It was not a public rejection, not dramatic enough to be called cruelty. It was colder than that. It was strategic omission. Myra remained where she was. She did not retreat or reach for him. She absorbed the shift in how others looked at her, the recalibration of their judgment. Pity did not appear. Neither did anger. What replaced neutrality was calculation. The pack did not see her pain. It saw instability. A weakness that could fracture order if left unaddressed. In that moment, Myra learned something fundamental. Compassion was not currency here. Strength was not kindness. And belonging was conditional, always subject to revision. She had crossed an invisible line simply by existing in the wrong configuration. The gathering ended without incident. People dispersed. The gym returned to its normal shape. Myra left alone, stepping back into the night where streetlights reflected off wet pavement. The concrete under her feet bore the marks of tires, cracks filled with moss, traces of lives moving forward without hesitation. She walked home by the river, feeling the echo of the pulls still inside her, unresolved. The city did not react. The forest remained silent. But the order she had relied on had shifted, and she knew with certainty that the pack would not leave the error uncorrected for long. The morning after the gathering arrived without ceremony, as if the night had never cracked the surface of the city. Streets were wet from an early drizzle, cars moved with habitual impatience. Coffee shops opened their doors to commuters who did not notice the tension threading the air. For the pack, however, the absence was immediate and unmistakable. Cale Voss did not appear. At first it registered as a delay. He was known for keeping irregular hours, for disappearing into the forest when decisions required solitude. No one panicked in the first hour. By midday, the silence sharpened. His house stood untouched, security system armed, no signs of forced entry. The gym's cameras showed nothing beyond the usual late-night cleaning crew and the hum of empty space. His phone did not ping, did not move, did not register location. The digital and physical contours of his life simply ended. Searches began quietly, then widened. Trackers moved through the forest at the edge of the suburbs, following trails that usually spoke clearly to those who knew how to read them. This time the ground offered nothing coherent. Scents overlapped, paths dissolved, impressions vanished into leaf litter as if intentionally erased. It felt wrong, not like concealment but like subtraction. The forest did not resist the search, it absorbed it. By evening, Rowan Creed stepped into the vacuum. As Beta, the transition of authority was technically temporary, but necessity hardened it quickly. He issued orders with efficiency, restructuring patrol schedules, limiting movement beyond marked boundaries, suspending non-essential operations. Lone excursions were forbidden. Checkpoints appeared where none had existed before. The pack accepted this without protest, because uncertainty demanded structure, and Rowan provided it with firm clarity. Days passed without resolution. The longer Cale remained missing, the more the collective unease transformed. It did not erupt in open rebellion or fear. It seeped into behavior. In the city, pack members lost restraint. Minor disagreements escalated into physical altercations. A bar fight ended with shattered glass and police lights. 2 unexplained car accidents occurred within a week, both involving drivers known to be part of the community. These incidents were written off as coincidence, but beneath them ran a shared agitation, an itch beneath the skin that could not be scratched. Within the pack, conversations shifted. Loyalty remained intact on the surface, but beneath it grew ambition and anxiety. Some began to position themselves, offering opinions unasked, volunteering for visibility. Others withdrew, guarding territory, hoarding influence. Rowan observed it all, cataloging reactions, measuring who leaned into order and who leaned toward fracture. His authority strengthened not because he demanded it, but because he filled the space where Cale had been. Then came the sightings. The first report arrived through a shaky call late at night, dismissed initially as hysteria. A white animal near the river, larger than a normal wolf, moving with an intelligence that unsettled the observer. Within 48 hours, more reports followed. A pale shape near the Foundation's storage buildings. Tracks near the edge of the forest that did not match any known pattern. A brief appearance on a parking lot, camera behind the security firm where Myra worked. The image grainy but unmistakable in its mass and posture. This was no rumor. Patrols confirmed it visually, though never for long. The white beast crossed boundaries deliberately, ignoring scent markers that delineated territory. It did not avoid the pack's land, it occupied it. It lingered where it should not, disappeared when approached, reappeared somewhere else with unnerving precision. Each failed attempt to corner it only sharpened its legend. The pack's unease found a shape it could grasp. A foreign presence, bold and invasive, was easier to confront than the emptiness left by a missing alpha. The narrative formed quickly and spread without resistance. The white beast had challenged the hierarchy. The white beast had confronted Cale. The white beast had taken him. Cause and effect aligned neatly, requiring no introspection. If there was an enemy, there was no need to question the system that had failed to protect its leader. Myra watched this unfold from behind screens and data streams. Her nights blurred into sequences of timestamps and camera angles. She traced movement patterns through the city, overlaying reports with recorded footage, mapping appearances against patrol routes. Where others saw randomness, she saw intent. The white beast did not roam aimlessly. Its path curved, looped, adjusted. Over time, she noticed a disturbing symmetry. The sightings formed a loose perimeter around her routines. Her apartment by the river, her workplace, the routes she took home when dawn thinned the streets. She did not share this immediately. Instinct warned her that drawing attention to herself would accelerate suspicion. Still, as days passed, pressure mounted. Rowan requested her analyses, her conclusions. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, but his questions grew pointed. The timing of events, her presence at the gathering, the emergence of the beast, Kale's disappearance. Patterns could be read in more than one way. Within the pack, the idea of blame took root. Myra felt it in subtle shifts. Conversations quieted when she entered rooms. Glances lingered too long. She was no longer invisible, she was anomalous. Her lack of a wolf, once tolerated, became evidence of otherness. If the pack could not explain the catastrophe, it could assign it. She had been the variable. She had drawn attention. She had been seen as fate's mistake. Rowan did not accuse her openly. He did not need to. He allowed the implication to breathe, to circulate, to become consensus without declaration. He suggested that her connection to the disappearance was statistically relevant. He implied that her presence might provoke the beast, that she could serve as a lure if containment became necessary. He framed it as pragmatism, not cruelty. Stability required sacrifices, and she had never been fully part of the equation. Myra understood the danger with painful clarity. If the situation deteriorated further, she would become expendable. A scapegoat, a tool, or both. Her safety had always depended on Kale's shadow. Without it, she stood exposed. At night, the forest pressed closer. The city lights faded quickly beyond the last row of houses, swallowed by dense trees that seemed to lean inward. The trails beyond the suburbs twisted and overlapped, leading deeper into darkness that did not reflect light the way streets did. Search parties moved through that space with growing aggression, frustration sharpening their movements. The forest did not yield. It swallowed sound, blurred scent, distorted distance. It did not release what it took. Myra sensed, without being able to articulate how, that Kale had not simply vanished. Something held him in that space between concrete and roots, between order and instinct. And whatever walked the edges of the city in white fur was not merely an intruder. It was a consequence. As pressure closed in, Myra remained outwardly compliant. She delivered reports, adjusted algorithms, assisted where asked. Inwardly, she recalibrated. She noted which patrols passed where, which cameras lagged, which routes were overlooked. She recognized the shape of a hunt before it was declared. The forest did not let go easily. It never had. And now, as the pack's fear sharpened into resolve, Myra understood that the next phase would demand more than observation. It would demand choice. The night she went to the river did not feel heroic or reckless. It felt procedural. Myra understood patterns, and the pattern was clear. Pressure narrowed until it crushed what lay at the center. She had become adjacent to that center whether she wanted it or not. If she waited, she would be used. If she moved first, she might still choose the terms. She left her apartment after midnight, when the city thinned to a skeleton of light and sound. She carried only what she could justify if stopped. A small medical kit tucked into a canvas bag, a flashlight with a narrow beam, her phone turned off to avoid tracking. She wore dark clothing that did not catch reflections and shoes meant for uneven ground. Nothing about her looked defiant. She moved like someone who belonged to the night shift, invisible by habit. The path to the river cut through a strip of land that the city never quite claimed. Gravel gave way to dirt to roots slick with moisture. The air cooled noticeably, carrying the smell of water and decaying leaves. Myra slowed as she approached the tree line, letting her breathing settle. She did not call out. She did not announce herself. She knew better than to challenge an unknown presence with noise. The forest responded by going still. It was not the absence of sound that unsettled her, but the way sound seemed to withdraw. Insects quieted. The distant rush of the river dulled, as if muffled by unseen hands. Even the wind paused, leaves suspended in a tense, listening state. Myra stopped walking. She stood with one foot braced against a root, weight balanced, light off. Her pulse counted seconds. The white wolf emerged without warning. It stepped into the thin spill of moonlight near the water's edge, its size immediately wrong. Larger than any wolf she had seen, its frame carried power without bulk, muscles stretched lean beneath pale fur that reflected light too cleanly. It did not snarl. It did not bare its teeth. It simply stood, head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on her with a focus that felt deliberate rather than instinctive. Blood marked its coat. Dark stains clung to the fur along its flank and shoulder, irregular and partially dried. One foreleg bore weight reluctantly, the joint stiff, movement measured. Each breath expanded its ribcage unevenly, as if drawing air cost effort. The wolf was injured but not helpless. It radiated restraint, the kind born not of weakness but of calculation. Myra did not run. She felt fear register and settle, processed rather than indulged. The animal did not behave like a predator encountering prey. It did not circle or test. It maintained distance, as if allowing space for a decision. The eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that made her chest tighten: recognition. Not familiarity in the animal sense, but acknowledgement, as though it understood her presence as intentional. She switched on the flashlight and angled it down, illuminating the ground between them rather than the wolf's face. She crouched slowly and set the medical kit on the dirt, hands visible, movements controlled. The wolf did not advance or retreat. It watched. The moment stretched, fragile and absolute. Myra realized then that whatever stood before her was not simply a threat to be neutralized. It was a question, and the answer would define what followed. She moved closer in increments, careful not to trigger a reaction. The wolf's muscles tensed when she crossed an invisible boundary, but it did not attack. It tracked her hands, her posture, the tilt of her head. When she reached a point where the blood smell sharpened, she stopped. The injury was worse up close. A deep gash marred the pale fur, edges angry and raw, the wound not fresh but not healing cleanly either. She did not touch it yet. She observed. There was discipline in the way the wolf held itself, pain contained rather than expressed. It endured stillness with a patience that did not belong to an animal driven purely by instinct. Myra had seen that posture before, in rooms where power was assumed rather than displayed. Her thoughts aligned rapidly, assembling fragments she had refused to connect. The decision came fully formed. She could not treat the wound here, too exposed, too close to patrol routes. She needed shelter, concealment, time. The abandoned riverfront hangar came to mind, a relic from before redevelopment stalled, officially condemned and unofficially ignored. It sat far enough from the main trails to escape casual notice, close enough to water to mask scent. Risky, but viable. Myra stood and stepped back, turning her body slightly away from the wolf, not presenting her back but signaling direction. She moved toward the hangar, pausing after a few steps. When she looked back, the wolf had followed, limping but silent. The distance remained, but the choice had been made. The hangar loomed like a forgotten ribcage, metal warped by time and moisture. Inside, shadows layered over debris and old equipment. Myra cleared a space quickly, working by feel, then returned to the wolf with gauze and antiseptic. The process was slow, cautious. She cleaned the wound as best she could, aware that any sudden movement could end her life. The wolf endured it without a sound, body rigid, eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder as if focusing on something internal. When she finished, She backed away and sat against the wall, exhaustion seeping into her bones. The wolf lay down opposite her, careful with its injured side, never turning its back on her but no longer coiled to strike. The silence between them changed texture. It became less threatening, more watchful. Over the following days, Myra returned with food and supplies, timing her visits to avoid patrol patterns she had memorized. Each time, she learned more. The wolf responded to her presence not with possessiveness but with expectation. It waited for her before eating. It adjusted its position when she moved, mirroring her rhythm unconsciously. When pain spiked, it endured it with a restraint that spoke of training, of habit. At times, something shifted behind its eyes. The sharp, animal focus dulled into something distant, contemplative. It recognized her voice cadence even without understanding words, responded to her pauses and emphasis. Once, when a sudden noise echoed outside, it positioned itself between her and the entrance without prompting, injured leg forgotten for the moment. Protection, not dominance. Myra cataloged everything. She compared the wolf's appearances with the gaps in camera footage, the blind spots Cale had always insisted remain unmonitored. She mapped the timing of patrol routes against the beast's movements. She recalled Cale's posture, his stillness under pressure, the way he observed rather than reacted. The alignment became undeniable. The realization settled with a quiet finality. Cale was not missing. He was imprisoned. Not captured, not hidden, but trapped within a form that stripped him of authority and voice. A curse, precise and cruel, had forced him into the shape of the very instinct he had spent his life mastering. This was not illness or injury. It was intention encoded into magic, designed to isolate and degrade without killing. The white fur was not a symbol of purity, but of exposure, making him visible and vulnerable in ways a darker form might not have been. Myra felt the weight of it press into her lungs. The pack was hunting its own alpha without knowing it, driven by fear and convenience. And she was the only one who saw the truth. Meanwhile, Rowan's grip tightened. With each day Cale remained absent, Rowan's authority solidified. He convened elders more frequently, framing his actions as temporary measures for stability. Younger wolves gravitated toward him, drawn by clarity and the promise of order. He spoke of threats, of the necessity of decisive action. The white beast became the focus of his narrative, an external danger that justified escalation. He was not cruel for its own sake. He believed genuinely that leadership required sacrifice, that individuals were expendable if the structure survived. To him, Cale's disappearance was tragedy, but also opportunity. A vacuum demanded filling, and he intended to ensure it was filled by someone capable of hard choices. Myra felt the clock accelerate. If the hunt was declared openly, the hangar would not remain hidden for long. The wolf's condition worsened subtly, moments of lucidity shortening, instinct pressing harder against restraint. Each night risked being the one where the human inside did not resurface. She stood between two outcomes, neither forgiving. Exposure meant death. Delay meant loss of what remained of Cale, and tied to both was her own fate. Rowan would not hesitate to remove her once she outlived her utility or became too disruptive. The forest outside the hangar pressed close, ancient and indifferent. It held secrets without judgment, but it did not offer mercy. Myra understood now that saving Cale would require more than hiding him. It would require confronting the mechanism that bound him, and the people who would rather see him destroyed than destabilize the order he once maintained. Time, already scarce, began to feel borrowed. Myra did not chase the curse through folklore or ceremonial ruins, because she had grown up around wolves long enough to know that most of what they called tradition was either an excuse or a warning. Real power rarely announced itself with chanting and candles. It hid in infrastructure, in favors owed, in quiet locations that endured because nobody wanted to look too closely. If Kale had been trapped inside a white predator's body by something unnatural, the source was not going to be a theatrical shrine. It would be practical, local, and patient. Portland had a way of swallowing strange things without digesting them. The city's edges were full of places that looked ordinary until someone needed them to be otherwise. A basement under a closed diner, a storage unit rented under a false name, a nonprofit office that never opened to the public. Myra had spent years reading patterns on screens, mapping human behavior through camera angles and alarm pings, and she understood the same logic applied to the supernatural. The pack did not exist in the forest alone. It existed in the seams between neighborhoods, behind legitimate storefronts that made them appear harmless. Anything capable of shaping fate would be hidden the same way. She remembered the rumors because she had listened when others spoke as if she was furniture. She had been in rooms where older wolves lowered their voices, not out of kindness, but out of habit, as if certain names attracted attention. A small antique shop in an older quarter, close enough to the river to smell brine on wet mornings, was mentioned the way people mentioned illness. Not as gossip, but as something to avoid. Wolves said that those who entered it came out with changed priorities. They said the shop contained objects that were not meant to belong to the same world at once. They said people sometimes disappeared behind its door for a night and returned with eyes that looked as if they had stared too long at something bright. The owner was not called a magician. He was called a resolver because what he offered was not wonder but resolution, and resolution did not require compassion. Myra did not tell anyone where she was going. She left her phone in her studio, powered down and tucked into a drawer, as if turning it off could reduce the chance of being tracked by mundane means. She wore clothing that would not stand out, a dark jacket with a hood, sturdy boots, hair tied back, nothing scented. She avoided the pack's usual routes through town and did not drive directly from the territory. She moved like someone used to being watched because she was. The cameras she monitored at night had taught her the most important rule. What mattered was not whether someone looked at you, but whether they noticed you. The old quarter felt different from the edges of suburbia where the pack hid in plain sight. The streets were narrower, the buildings older, their brickwork stained by decades of rain. The air carried layered smells: coffee, damp wood, exhaust, the metallic tang of the river. The foot traffic was thin, and what people walked here did not feel like leisure. Even the streetlights seemed tired, their halos softer than in newer districts. The shop did not advertise. There was no bright signage, no curated window display meant to attract the curious. The front window was crowded with objects that looked like remnants rather than merchandise. Brass compasses dulled by age, rolled maps secured with cracked leather straps, chipped ship lanterns, small carved boxes whose lids did not quite align. The glass itself was filmed with dust, as if it had been wiped but never fully cleaned, leaving faint swirls that caught the light. Above the door hung a sign that did not carry words, only a worn emblem that might have been a stylized knot or a symbol with meaning lost to time. Myra had walked past the place before without stopping. Now, standing close, she felt a subtle pressure in the air, a sense that sound did not travel normally near the threshold. Cars passed on the street, but their noise seemed muted, as if the shop absorbed it. The bell above the door sounded when she entered, not bright and welcoming, but dull, like a warning that had been repeated too many times. The interior smelled of old paper, metal, and something dry and faintly sweet that did not belong to any familiar chemical. Light came from mismatched lamps, casting uneven shadows across shelves stacked too high. The aisles were tight, as if the shop had been packed deliberately to prevent people from walking straight. Myra noticed, with the instinct of someone who measured spaces for a living, that the place had blind spots. Corners where a person could stand unseen. Gaps between shelves that implied passageways, though no doorways were visible. The resolver was behind a counter that looked older than the building, its surface scarred by shallow cuts and stains that might have been ink, oil, or something else. He did not appear dramatic. That was what unsettled Myra most. He looked like someone who could stand in line at a grocery store and be forgotten immediately after. His face carried no obvious menace, only an absence of softness. He watched her in a way that suggested he had already decided what she was long before she opened her mouth. Myra kept her posture steady. She did not present herself as a supplicant because she suspected that was part of how costs were chosen. She had learned in the pack that weakness invited correction. Here, she sensed the same principle, only colder. She did not come to bargain. She came to understand, and understanding required careful language. She did not ask for Kale to be restored. The wish logic embedded in every rumor about the resolver was consistent. The literal mattered more than the intended. Myra knew enough stories of badly phrased requests turning into permanent punishments to avoid anything that sounded like reversal. She framed her need as information. She needed the origin of what had been done, the mechanism, the identity of the hand that set it in motion, and whether the process could be stopped before it finished consuming what remained of Kale's mind. She wanted to know how long a person could stay trapped in a shifted body before the human part became too thin to reach. The answer arrived with the same unemotional finality as a verdict. The curse had not come from an outside enemy. No rival pack had breached their territory with secret rites. No hunter had used silver and scripture. The origin was internal, born from the pack's own desperation. It had been triggered by a single wish, spoken by someone bound to the pack by blood and proximity, someone who had wanted to fix an unbearable imbalance. The wish had not been shaped like murder. It had been shaped like correction. It had been aimed at making Kale less unreachable, less capable of rejecting what fate insisted on binding. It had been spoken in grief and anger at the same time, and it had been phrased with the careless certainty of youth. Magic, indifferent to human context, had complied. It had stripped Kale of the part of him that could decide. It had taken the voice that could refuse, the leadership that could hold the pack together through discipline, the distance that made him untouchable. It had left strength and hunger. It had built a body that could not speak, could not justify itself, could not negotiate. A beast could not reject anyone. A beast could only follow instinct and be used as a symbol by whoever framed the narrative first. Myra felt the shift in her understanding as something physical, as if her ribs tightened around her lungs. The worst part was not the cruelty of the result. It was the intimacy of it. Kale had not been targeted by strangers. He had been wounded from inside his own structure by a hand that likely believed it was helping. As Myra absorbed the implications, she understood another layer. The price of that wish was not contained. It was not paid once and finished. It was ongoing, extracted gradually from the network of lives connected to Kale. The longer he remained trapped in the white wolf, the more the pack's collective balance frayed. Wolves were not humans who could tolerate uncertainty with quiet anxiety. They responded through instinct, and instinct demanded hierarchy. Without a stable alpha, the pack's nervous system misfired. Aggression rose. Patience shortened. Old resentments resurfaced and found excuses. The curse did not only imprison Kale, it poisoned the social body that depended on him. Myra left the shop without the relief she had hoped for. Clarity did not soften anything. It sharpened it. Outside, the old quarter looked the same, but Myra's perception had altered. She saw, in every passerby, the possibility of hidden context, of unseen motives. The river air felt colder. Her steps sounded louder on the pavement, as if the world had regained volume the moment she crossed the threshold back into normal streets. She did not rush. Panic was wasteful. She forced herself into the same controlled pace she used at work when alarms triggered in clusters. She needed her mind intact, because what she now carried could not be handed to anyone else safely. She returned to the hangar by routes that avoided pack patrol zones. The structure stood near the river, officially abandoned, unofficially part of the pack's shadow territory. Its metal skin was stained, its doors dented, graffiti half-painted over in old attempts at cleanliness. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of rust and damp concrete. Cale lay where she had made a nest of blankets and tarps, his white fur dulled by dried blood in places where the wounds had seeped. When he was awake, the tension in him was visible even at rest, as if his muscles never fully released. His breathing was steady, but there were moments when his attention snapped toward sounds that a normal animal might ignore. The longer he stayed in this form, the more the world seemed to speak to him in the language of threat and hunger. Myra worked methodically. She cleaned wounds, replaced bandages where she could, checked for infection, monitored his temperature by touch because she had nothing else. She watched his eyes when he looked at her. Some days they held something that felt like recognition, a careful stillness that belonged to a man who had carried responsibility for too long. Other days they were too bright, too sharp, reflecting the pure priority of a predator. Myra learned to measure those shifts, to treat them like data points. The curve was not encouraging. The human presence did not vanish at once. It thinned incrementally, like a signal degrading under interference. At the same time, the pack tightened around itself. Rowan's control became visible in daily life. Patrols increased. The gym's hours changed under the excuse of renovation. The auto shop closed early more often. Pack members who normally moved through the city without drawing attention began to cluster in groups, their posture more confrontational, their eyes less human. Myra saw it even from a distance when she drove past on errands. The way men stood too still near doorways, the way women glanced over shoulders as if expecting trouble. In the background, the rumor of the white beast hardened into certainty. Fear demanded a simple story, and Rowan gave it one. He did not present himself as a villain. He acted as a pragmatist. He spoke of civilians, of liability, of preserving their ability to remain hidden. He described the beast as an outsider that had crossed boundaries deliberately. He framed the hunt as defense. And because the pack's nerves were already raw, the argument settled into them easily. Wolves wanted action. They wanted a target that made the chaos make sense. Rowan gave them permission to focus their rising aggression outward. Myra understood that if she told them the truth, it would not stop them. It might accelerate them. To reveal that the curse was born from within would destabilize Rowan's claim to necessity, and he would react by silencing the information rather than integrating it. He would either dismiss Myra as manipulative or brand her as complicit. The elders would retreat into denial, because admitting internal fault meant admitting their structure had failed. The younger wolves would seize the story as another excuse for violence, this time against whoever was blamed for the wish. Either outcome ended with blood. And time continued to narrow. The curse did not wait for moral clarity. It pressed forward like rot. Cale's body healed faster than a human's, but his mind did not. Each day Myra watched him react to her presence, and she could not pretend that his instinctual ownership was separate from the curse's logic. The wish had stripped him of choice. The bond that had sparked between him and Myra now existed in a distorted environment where dominance and connection could bleed into the same impulse. Myra felt the pull of it even when she resisted numbing it. The vector toward him remained, constant and painful, as if some part of her nervous system had been calibrated to his proximity and could not recalibrate back. At night, when she returned to her studio, she slept poorly. She dreamed of white fur against black trees, of the river reflecting a moon that looked too sharp, of a throat that could not form words. She woke with tension in her jaw, then forced herself back into function. She could not afford to fall apart. The pack's pressure was already turning her into a suspect. She could feel it in the way certain people watched her too long, in the way Rowan's patrol routes began to overlap with places she frequented. She was not paranoid. She was trained to notice surveillance, and the pack was beginning to apply it. By the end of the chapter's arc, Myra stood in a narrow corridor between two converging outcomes. Rowan's hunt was becoming official, structured, and inevitable. Kale's humanity was thinning, the beast pressing closer to the surface each day. The origin of the curse was now known to her, and that knowledge was both weapon and liability. She could not hand it to anyone without triggering another kind of disaster. She could not do nothing without losing him completely. The resolver's principle haunted her because it revealed the core truth of the situation. Wishes were not undone. They were completed. And completion, in this context, looked like a pack driven into frenzy by absence, an alpha trapped in a body that could not speak, and a woman without a wolf forced into leadership by necessity rather than status. Myra did not have ritual authority or supernatural strength. She had endurance, observation, and a willingness to carry burden without applause. It was not enough to fight the pack head-on, and it was not enough to fight the curse with logic alone. Yet it was all she had, and she understood that the next steps would require not only finding the person who spoke the wish, but surviving the pack's need to punish someone for the chaos they could no longer contain. The realization arrived without drama, settling into Myra's mind the way hard truths always did. Quietly, completely, without room for denial. She could not save Kale by force. Strength, whether physical or hierarchical, belonged to the pack, and the pack was already moving in a single direction. She could not stop them with explanations either. Logic fractured under fear, and fear had already chosen its shape. Every argument she could make would be absorbed, bent, and repurposed to justify the hunt. If Kale was to survive as anything more than a memory, the solution would have to come from outside the instincts that governed wolves. What the pack called her weakness became, in that moment, her only advantage. Myra did not carry a wolf inside her. She did not feel the constant hum of dominance and submission, the pull toward collective reaction that bound the pack together in crisis. Where others were compelled by instinct, she retained distance. Where they surged, she could pause. Her mind did not dissolve into the shared emotional current that now flooded the territory. That separation had marked her as lesser for most of her life. Now it made her singular. She began to prepare without ceremony. Her first move was absence. She altered her routines subtly, leaving her apartment at different hours, abandoning predictable paths. She let fragments of her presence register on cameras she knew Rowan's patrols monitored, then vanish again. She walked close enough to the forest's edge to stir attention, then retreated. The white wolf responded as she expected. Its appearances shifted, tightening their orbit around her movements. The bond between them, distorted by the curse, functioned like a beacon. Wherever she lingered, the beast followed. When she was certain the pattern had set, she let it deeper. The forest thickened quickly beyond the familiar trails. Old growth closed overhead, branches interlocking to dim the sky. The ground became uneven, roots breaking through soil, fallen logs forcing detours. Myra moved with deliberate inefficiency, choosing paths that required judgment rather than speed. She left traces that could be read two ways, then doubled back, crossed streams, disturbed underbrush in places where scent would scatter. She was not trying to outrun pursuit. She was trying to reshape it. She set traps not for the wolf, but for those who hunted it. Loose rock piles collapsed under careless weight. Dead branches cracked loudly in areas she had already vacated, drawing attention away from her true direction. She routed movement through narrow gullies where even wolves had to slow, forcing patrols to compress and lose their advantage. The forest assisted without intention, its density magnifying every misstep. Myra did not fight it. She listened to it. Kale followed, his condition worsening with each passing hour. The white wolf's movements grew sharper, less controlled. Moments of recognition flickered and vanished. His eyes, once holding that careful stillness she associated with Kale's restraint, now reflected something more fractured. Hunger and purpose blurred together. He did not understand why he followed her, only that he could not stop. By the time the hunt closed in, the forest vibrated with it. Myra sensed the pack before she saw them. The air carried tension like static, a collective focus honed to a single point. Branches shifted unnaturally. The rhythm of movement behind her multiplied, no longer cautious but committed. Rowan had released them fully. This was no longer containment. It was extermination. Cale turned on her then. The shift was abrupt, terrifying in its clarity. His body coiled, muscles bunching as if she were prey rather than anchor. His eyes fixed on her with a focus that stripped her of identity, reducing her to motion and heat. The bond between them tightened painfully, pulling her toward him even as instinct screamed at her to retreat. For a moment, she saw exactly how the curse worked. It did not erase connection. It twisted it until attachment became possession and recognition became threat. Myra stopped running. She stood in a clearing choked with ferns and fallen branches, breath ragged, heart hammering. The wolf circled her once more, movements jerky, uncertain. This was the edge. If she fled now, he would give chase and the pack would close the distance. If she fought, she would die. If she pleaded, the words would mean nothing. Wolves did not negotiate at this level of instinct. She made a different choice. Myra let go of the last illusion she carried, the quiet hope that Cale could be restored by separating the beast from the man. That hope had sustained her, but it had also limited her. The curse fed on division. It thrived on the idea that one state was acceptable and the other was not. As long as Cale rejected what he was becoming, the spell retained leverage. She stepped closer instead of away. The movement startled him. The wolf hesitated, thrown off balance by behavior that did not match expectation. Myra did not reach for him. She did not try to dominate or soothe. She simply remained, fully present, refusing to categorize him as either monster or savior. Her fear did not vanish, but she did not allow it to govern her body. She accepted the possibility of death without dramatizing it. Inside her, the bond shifted. For the first time since it had ignited, it was not driven by longing or submission. It became deliberate. Myra anchored it not in need, but in will. She did not ask Cale to be human again. She did not beg him to remember. She acknowledged the creature before her exactly as it was, powerful and dangerous and real. And in that acknowledgement, she placed a condition the curse had never accounted for. Choice. The bond could not function without reciprocity. Fate alone was insufficient. As long as Cale's connection to her existed only as compulsion, it remained incomplete. Myra opened herself to the bond fully, not as an escape, but as a commitment that demanded response. She chose him with clear eyes, accepting the cost of that choice, but she did not surrender herself to him. The distinction mattered. The effect was immediate and violent. Cale's body convulsed, the motion tearing through him as if two impulses collided at full force. The wolf staggered, claws gouging into soil, breath ripping from his lungs in harsh bursts. For a terrifying instant, Myra thought she had miscalculated, that the curse would punish defiance by accelerating its hold. But then the resistance changed texture. The frenzy broke into something else. The beast did not vanish. It did not dissolve into light or retreat obediently. Instead, it stilled. Cale's eyes cleared incrementally, the predatory glare receding just enough to reveal awareness beneath it. Not comfort, not peace, awareness. The wolf lowered its head, not in submission, but in recognition. The bond between them settled into a new configuration, heavier but stable, no longer pulling uncontrollably in one direction. Inside Cale, the fracture closed. His human consciousness did not return by erasing the animal. It returned by integrating it. The curse had stripped him of agency by forcing him into a single role. Myra's choice restored that agency by refusing to define him narrowly. The beast remained part of him, but it was no longer sovereign. Instinct ceded space to intention. The spell, designed to make choice impossible, lost its mechanism. Around them, the forest held its breath. The pack reached the edge of the clearing moments later. Myra sensed them before she saw them, their collective presence pressing inward. But when they emerged, they slowed. Something in the clearing resisted their momentum. The wolf stood between them and Myra, not as a feral threat, but as a controlled barrier. His posture radiated authority they had not expected to see again. Confusion rippled through the hunters. The scent in the air had changed. The white beast no longer registered as purely other. Kale's imprint bled through, undeniable to those attuned to it. The hunt fractured at the edge of certainty. Instinct faltered without a clear target. Myra did not turn to face the pack. She remained oriented toward Kale, anchoring the bond through presence rather than display. She understood that what had happened could not be commanded or explained. It could only be maintained through continued choice. Rowan stood at the perimeter, reading the scene with narrowed focus. He recognized the shift even if he did not understand it fully. The calculus he had relied on no longer applied. The beast he had framed as enemy now carried the unmistakable weight of the alpha he had replaced. Order trembled, not because it was threatened, but because it had been redefined without his consent. The curse unraveled quietly. There was no visible sign of its dissolution, no dramatic release of energy. Its grip loosened because its purpose had been fulfilled and then negated. It had sought to remove Kale's capacity to refuse. It had succeeded until refusal transformed into acceptance. Once Kale chose Myra back, not as instinctual possession, but as conscious alignment, the spell had nothing left to enforce. Myra felt the change in her own body as a deep exhaustion, the cost of holding that line without instinct to carry her. Her legs trembled. Her breath burned. But she remained standing. She had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. Kale stayed with her, the white wolf's presence steady and contained. He did not advance on the pack. He did not retreat. He simply existed fully in a form that no longer denied any part of itself. The forest released its tension slowly, sounds returning in fragments. Leaves stirred. A distant bird called uncertainly. The hunt dissolved not because it was defeated, but because it no longer made sense. Myra understood then that survival had never been the real test. The true trial had been whether she could choose without erasing herself, and whether Kale could accept connection without losing control. They had both crossed that line, not unscathed, but intact. What followed would reshape the pack, the hierarchy, and the city's hidden balance. But that belonged to what came next. Here, in the clearing where instinct had failed and will had prevailed, the bond settled into something that could not be ordered, only sustained. And that, finally, was enough. The pack reached the clearing after the rupture had already settled into the ground. They arrived as a formation shaped by expectation, bodies angled forward, senses sharpened for violence. The forest received them without ceremony. It did not echo their intent or amplify it. It stood altered, as if something decisive had passed through and left residue too complex to categorize as victory or defeat. They saw him first. The white wolf stood at the center of the clearing, its presence no longer erratic or feral. The posture was controlled, weight balanced, gaze steady. The scent that radiated from him carried an imprint they recognized with instinctive certainty. It was Kale. Not as he had been, not as they remembered him at his most untouchable, but unmistakably himself. The animal form did not negate the authority embedded in that presence. If anything, it reframed it. He was no longer the distant figure who ruled by restraint alone. He was something that had endured fracture and returned with knowledge carved into muscle and nerve. The hunters slowed, then stopped. Confusion rippled through the group, not loud or chaotic, but precise. The narrative they had prepared for collapsed under sensory contradiction. The beast they had framed as an external threat did not behave like an enemy. It did not charge or flee. It did not challenge them for dominance. It simply existed, holding the clearing with a gravity that demanded acknowledgement. The forest, which had resisted them earlier, now felt neutral, no longer amplifying their aggression. Rowan Creed stood at the edge of the formation, reading the scene with an intensity sharpened by calculation. He understood faster than most that the ground had shifted beneath him. His authority had grown in the vacuum Cale left behind, fed by fear and the need for decisive action. Now that vacuum no longer existed. The justification that had sustained his leadership dissolved without confrontation. There was no enemy to rally against, no crisis to extend. The Alpha had returned, changed in ways that made the old arguments irrelevant. The elders moved next, slower, more cautious. Their instincts urged them to preserve coherence, to contain what could not be erased. They began shaping explanations even as understanding lagged behind observation. They framed the event internally as ordeal, as trial, as a test imposed by forces older than any one of them. It was a reflex born of survival, not wisdom. To admit the truth, that they had nearly destroyed their own structure in pursuit of convenience, would have fractured the pack beyond repair. So they reached for language that preserved continuity. None of that altered the fact that they had come prepared to kill. The realization lingered uncomfortably, like a splinter beneath skin. The pack had not hesitated to designate one of their own as expendable when his absence destabilized them. They had needed an enemy to avoid looking inward, and they had created one. That awareness did not resolve itself quickly. It embedded, waiting. Myra stood slightly apart from Cale, her presence quieter but no less decisive. She did not claim space through posture or scent. She did not perform authority. Yet her role in what had unfolded was evident to anyone capable of reading the scene beyond instinct. She had not fought the pack. She had not dominated the beast. She had remained when flight would have been easier and when violence would have been justified. That endurance registered in the same language wolves understood power, consequence. Her status shifted without proclamation. No decree was issued. No ritual elevated her. The change occurred in the way eyes tracked her movements, in the subtle recalibration of distance when she stepped forward. She was no longer categorized as empty. She was no longer background. She had become a reference point, the one who had acted when the structure itself had failed. The pack recognized this not through admiration, but through necessity. She had preserved what they had nearly lost, and that could not be undone. Cale acknowledged her presence with a gravity that carried weight. It was not possessive and not symbolic. He did not claim her as a prize or elevate her as an emblem. He aligned with her as an equal in consequence, as someone who had held the line when authority dissolved. The bond between them no longer distorted the air with compulsion. It settled into something dense and stable, a shared orientation rather than a pull. This altered the hierarchy, in ways no one could immediately articulate. Power within the pack had always been measured by proximity to instinct, by the ability to channel the beast without losing control. Cale's transformation challenged that metric. He had not lost the beast, he had integrated it. He returned not as an idealized alpha, but as a leader marked by exposure to his own limits. That visibility disrupted old assumptions. Strength was no longer defined solely by dominance. It now included the capacity to endure fracture without turning outward. Rowan felt the consequence of that shift acutely. He was not cast out. He was not punished. The pack did not need a villain to complete the narrative. His pragmatism had not been malicious. It had been efficient, and efficiency had nearly cost them everything. He remained within the structure, but his influence contracted. He was left to inhabit the outcome of his decisions, to understand that control built on absence could not survive presence. The realization did not soften him immediately. It hollowed him, leaving space where certainty had been. The city absorbed the change without spectacle. Portland had always been adept at forgetting what did not demand constant attention. In the days that followed, the bar fight ceased. Patrols thinned. Traffic accidents returned to statistical normalcy. The surface of daily life smoothed over as it always did, yet something subtle persisted in the margins. The forest felt less hostile, its tension dissipated. The river carried sound differently, no longer sharp with unease. The city had recorded the disturbance in ways it would never articulate, adjusting its rhythms accordingly. Myra returned to her routines with measured care. She went back to the night shift, to screens and alerts and the quiet discipline of observation. Her work remained the same, but her position within the system had altered. Information flowed to her more directly. Decisions were deferred in her presence rather than made around her. She did not seek influence. She accepted it as responsibility, understanding that visibility carried risk. The pack's trust did not reset instantly. It recalibrated slowly, built on acknowledgement rather than sentiment. Cale resumed leadership without ceremony. He did not rush to reassert control. He allowed the pack to stabilize, to feel the absence of immediate threat. He adjusted structures that had relied too heavily on fear, not out of moral awakening, but because he had seen how quickly fear consumed itself. His authority sharpened, stripped of unnecessary distance. He remained formidable, but no longer untouchable. The beast within him breathed alongside his decisions, not beneath them, and that proximity informed every choice. The curse did not vanish without residue. There were nights when Cale woke with tension coiled beneath his skin, when instinct pressed closer than memory. There were moments when Myra sensed the bond tighten unexpectedly, reminding her that connection was never neutral. The pack, too, carried scars. Trust, once fractured, did not reseal seamlessly. It required maintenance, vigilance, the constant refusal of easy enemies. What emerged was not harmony. It was equilibrium. A balance held not by denial, but by awareness. The pack learned, slowly and unevenly, that weakness was not synonymous with failure, and that unity enforced through fear was brittle. Myra's existence within that structure became proof of a different metric. She had no beast to command. She had no instinctual authority. She had remained when others chose simplicity, and that refusal had changed the outcome. The city remembered. It remembered in the way the forest no longer resisted certain paths, in the way the river's sound softened near the hangar, even after it returned to abandonment, in the way people moved through shared spaces with a fraction more restraint, as if something had taught them the cost of unchecked reaction. Memory did not manifest as monument or myth. It embedded quietly, altering behavior without announcement. Myra stood within that altered landscape with a clarity she had not possessed before. She understood now that communities were never stable by default. They survived through choices made under pressure, and most of those choices were invisible until their consequences accumulated. She had not saved the pack through exceptional power. She had saved it by refusing to surrender agency when instinct demanded it. That refusal carried weight precisely because it could not be commanded or replicated easily. The story did not end with resolution wrapped in certainty. It ended with continuation. Cale and Myra moved forward not as symbols of redemption, but as reminders of cost. The pack adjusted, not uniformly and not without resistance, but permanently. The city resumed its quiet indifference, carrying beneath it the imprint of what had almost occurred. And in that remembered space, where concrete met forest and instinct met choice, the rules had shifted just enough to matter. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.